All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Praxis 513 on the Common. So this evening we're going to jump into a conversation midstream. We're jumping into a conversation that's been going on now for over a decade between, on the one hand, advocates of the common, the concept of this in the singular, right? Not modeled on the public commons, but on a notion of common use governed through democratic processes, such as Hart and Negri or Dardot and Laval have been developing. So a notion of the common from a communalist perspective, and then on the other hand, radical leftist critical legal scholars who, since the realism of the 1920s to the critical legal studies movement of the 1970s and to today, have sought to reconstruct property relations along more egalitarian dimensions. Before we launch into the conversation tonight, which will be about the fourth or fifth iteration of this dialogue and of this conversation, I thought in order to make sure that everyone's on the same page, and not only tonight, but anyone who would listen in the future, that I'd quickly like to map the terrain where we have been before turning first with Mikhaïl Xifaras' intervention to the fourth or fifth level of the conversation. So for our purposes tonight, I think that the first salvo, or the first intervention, is Hart and Negri's 2009 book, Commonwealth, where they spell out a notion of the common, drawing from Grotius and Locke, predominantly on early modern conceptions of the law of private property. They argued there for a notion of the common that differs both from private property and from state-controlled property, public property, in that it, by contrast to those other two forms, does not figure predominantly within the realm of the legal tradition. As Hart would say, the common is that which is not property. In other words, the common is the negative of property as monopoly over use, implying equal access, and the negative of property as monopoly over decision-making, implying a democratic decision-making or a democratic form of management. Now, Hart and Negri were confronted after the publication of Commonwealth by critiques by critical legal scholars, and in part by Duncan Kennedy, for having failed to engage more contemporary understandings of the law of property. Property not as a substantive thing, but as a bundle of rights, as Hofeld and the realists and the critical legal scholars established in their tradition of left critique, internal critique of the law. Duncan Kennedy accused Hart and Negri of a conceptual error, not to think of property as a substance or a thing, but instead as a bundle of rights that pertains to many and whatever the emanations from that might be. He also accused them of a political error, that progressive legal theory in action must work within property law, within private law, to advance certain rights over others. The struggle against property itself, Duncan argued, was naive and potentially counterproductive. In a very honest and admirable way, Hart recognized that he and Negri had used perhaps an inadequate foil for their first project in the Commonwealth, and Hart admitted, admirably, I think, in his words, "I was a couple of centuries behind in my reading," as I often find myself. So, in their newest book, Assembly, from 2017, Hart and Negri really respond to the critical jurists and reformulate their proposal for the common. And the proposal does not differ that much, or that's what we're going to, in some sense, that's what we're going to explore, and that's going to be part of our discussion. The question is, how much does it differ? It may not differ that much from the original version, except to address specifically the question of the internal and the external of the law. And as Hart and Negri make clear in Assembly, their conception of the common remains beyond property. They write, only one step further of the bundle of rights theory, but they do emphasize that any notion of the common must propose ways of managing the common goods. There must be a democratic mechanism for determining its use, which would be a form of regulation. So the common is fully regulated, but regulated through democratic forms, democratic management, rather than monopolistic manner. Open and equal access and democratic decision-making is what would characterize it, on the model, perhaps, at least Hart suggests, of Zuccotti Park and what happened there. And of course, examples of this and examples that we'll be talking about this evening may be Creative Commons, resistance to patents, privatization or resisting privatization of shared knowledge. Other examples would be the metropolis as a common space, etc. Now, it's about there in the debate, I think, including the important passages on institutions and institutional design that Hart and Negri develop and that Camille Robcis picks up on in her work. It's about there that, that we're going to pick up this evening. And to push the debate forward, it's really my delight to have three brilliant theorists, and I'll present them quickly in the order in which they're going to speak. So first, to my right is Mikhaïl Xifaras, who joins us from Sciences Po, where he's professor of public law, which translates in America as professor of private law. Because, no, well, I mean, public law in France, public law in France is American private law, and private law in France is American public law. And where he teaches legal philosophy, property, and jurisprudence. He's been the director of the doctoral program there for many years at Sciences Po and has spearheaded with Christophe Jamin the law school, which is a radical intervention in French higher education, and which will in part be part of the conversation this evening, I think. And he's also been on our side of the Atlantic a lot as a visiting professor at Harvard Law School for many years, 2011 to 2016. After Mikhaïl, we will hear from our own inimitable Etienne Balibar, our professor of philosophy at Columbia University, and who is, no, you're ours, you are ours, and who is also co-collaborator in all of these seminars, and for whom we're deeply grateful for his presence and continued interventions. As you know, of course, co-author of Reading Marx with Louis Althusser and a few others, and author of many other books, Race, Nation, Class, We the People, but Equilibrity, political essays, which are so formative, and of course, Citizenship. After Etienne Balibar, we'll hear from Camille Robcis, who is also our inimitable professor here in history and French at Columbia University. Her teaching and research interests focus in three broad areas: historical construction of norms, intellectual production of knowledge, and the articulation of universalism and difference in modern French history. Her first book was titled The Law of Kinship, Anthropology, Psychoanalysis, and the Family in France, published in 2013. And she's now working on a second book on institutional psychoanalysis, which in part will be part of this conversation, since it raises important questions about institutional design, and that are raised essentially, or that are raised when we will think about the common. Now, we also have a splendid group with us, including Katharina Pistor, who's joining us from the law school, where she's the Edwin B. Barker Professor of Comparative Law and the Director of the Center on Global Legal Transformation, Camila Vergara, who is a PhD student in political theory, Daniele Lorenzini, postdoc, who is going to be Professor of Philosophy at Warwick in next semester, the following semester, Jason Frank, political theory from Cornell, Marianne Hirsch, William Peterfeld Trent Professor of English, and John Rackman, Hanok Dagon, who joins us from Tel Aviv and Columbia Law School. Jesus Velasco, I see Bruno. I mean, so we're just blessed to have so many people. Most importantly, though, Esteban Perez. Esteban Perez, who I went to high school with. I'm so glad to see you. And who works for the United Nations, is an economist, and is down in Chile right now, but visiting in New York. So welcome, Esteban. All right, okay, all right. And Stephen Lukes, I forgot, next to Esteban is Stephen Lukes, who's back with us today. So, I mean, we're really blessed to have a great conversation, which Mikhaïl is going to start.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, Ghislaine. I don't know, Guylaine or whatever. Wow, what a treat, really. And thanks to Camille and Etienne, who prepared this based on a paper that I circulated and that is very long, and that's not going to be the base of my intervention, because as Bernard was saying, we've moved on in the conversation. So this paper was dealing with Commonwealth, and in the meanwhile, I myself discovered this chapter 6 of Assembly, which is obliging me to transform a bit my argument. So the argument is not of the kind, wow, how come these guys didn't read all that stuff, from that to, well, although they read it, I'm not sure that they get it all. So I'm going to try to develop that idea. It seems to me that the key question here is when one to formulate emancipatory project, really radical emancipatory projects, things that are anti-capitalist, revolutionary, does that type of project got to throw the baby law with the water, or can that be done from within the legal frame, legal context, legal realm, like Etienne is saying in his paper? So is a radical revolutionary project got to be anti-juridical or not? Or subversion from within could work? I think that's the key element. And I want immediately to say that I have nothing against radical anti-juridism in general. Sometimes it produces beautiful books that are got effet de vérité, effects of truth, that are really fantastic. Some of the most beautiful books I've read are belonging to that tradition. So my argument is not that that is bad and we should substitute. Yeah. It's just that sometimes I don't see anti-juridism as a strategy being a leap, a radical move, but a leap in abstraction. And I find this damageable to the projects. And I think that one of the interesting things that one can do is to try to reconciliate radicalism with being a bit concrete. And that requires to taking charge the legal element. So I would say one way to understand Nigger as an art project would be to try to frame the discussion in very classical terms. That would be returning the weapons of the master against the master. Mm-hmm. And so we all agree that law is very important in structuring exploitation, domination in our world. So I don't think that is an element of debate. So from there, it's possible very easily to go to law is the weapon of the master. And then the question would be, shall we return the weapon of the master against the master or not? Or not, meaning trying to invent, create, produce our own weapons. If the question is put that way, the answer seems to me evident. The most radical, the most emancipatory, and the most revolutionary and interesting project are obviously to invent our own weapons. Except that I precisely don't think that the question has to be settled in that way. Why? Because I don't think that law is an instrument. or is a weapon, or at least not only. I understand law rather as a praxis, a certain type of discourse, and therefore and therefore I don't see it as a mean to an end, or definitely not only, but as a playground or a battlefield. So I don't think it's a returning the weapon of the master against the master question. Now concretely, let's take the example of probity, because that's the central object of the conversation. So Negri and Hart in Commonwealth are telling us that probity is a legal form for sure, and the modern definition of this legal form is exclusive, subjective, absolute right of an owner on his thing, the sole dominion, Blackstone's sole dominion. And here too, everybody agrees that modern probity, let's say in 1789 in France, was something like that. I understand this definition as totally embedded in a certain conception of what law is. I'm not going to develop that very, I mean, it would be too long, but in the paper I'm spending pages and pages trying to explain that. The structure being twofold. The first level is the system. And what is the system? It's a constellation of logically relating one with each other institutions of law. Property, contracts, those things. And each of these institutions of law is associated with a unique concept. Property is sole dominion. Contract is free exchange of will, whatever, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that system can be applied in reality. That's why law is shaping our lives. And the application is the second level, and the idea is that the level of the application is pretty transparent, and that's the reason why actually the system is structuring our lives. So here, the key element is that for one legal institution, say property, you can associate it with one concept, say sole dominion, and you can also produce a political evaluation. You can say it's great, or you can say it's horrible, which is exactly what Negri and Hart is saying. They're saying probity is not development, justice, and fairness. It's exactly the opposite. It's domination, exploitation, it's bad. Okay. So I have here an obstacle to economic life, the basis of unjust structure of social control, and the prime factor that creates and maintains social hierarchies and inequality. The problem with property is not merely that some have and some don't. Private property itself is the problem. And I want to say, wow, so vintage, so modern. So I think the real question is, if you want to be anti-capitalist, and if you want to produce a critique of capitalism, does that have to be a critique of property, understanding property as the bad thing that is structuring a capitalist society? And I want to go a bit further with this, and I want to discuss this idea of bundle of rights. In assembly, Negri and Hart are discussing the idea of bundle of rights. They're not only discussing that, by the way, they're also discussing the social function of the law. But I'm going to focus on the bundle of rights, but many things could be said about other critical traditions. And they're saying, well, this is great. I mean, of course, here is a much more pluralistic and relational conception of property, because it allows to open to the rights of third parts, and it's not just the sole dominion of a unique owner. So that is very interesting. Nevertheless, it is keeping something that is ineliminable in property, which is exclusivity. And therefore, therefore, it's a mere social democrat attempt to criticize property, because the real revolutionary thing and the real thing to do is to go against and beyond property. I really think here that they're totally missing the point of what the idea of bundle of right is. So the idea of bundle of right, and more generally, I would say, what the critical legal tradition is borrowing, is the idea that we don't need a definition of property. That's the idea that actually what's property might not be the relevant question. The question is, what does that do? How does that work? But so to put it in another way, the bundle of rights is not an alternative definition to property. It's a method or a protocol. It's a theoretical protocol that allows to understand and to analyze a given concrete situation. So Felix Cohen, for example, said that very well in this so famous article, Transcendental Nonsense. A thing is what it does. So the question, what is property, what is a corporation, all these questions, not that interesting. And that is an epistemological rupture with the modern conception of the law, where the system is a constellation of legal institution defined by a unique concept. So the idea is that we don't need that. And that's a much more radical move than Negri and Hart actually think. So, of course, when they go, they discuss the bundle of rights and they say, see, it's not that radical. Look at law and economics. They're extremely conservative and they're using that idea of bundle of rights. Of course they do. Whoever can. That's not the problem. The problem is the idea of bundle of rights allows you to do distributional analysis. So then the question is, how do you want it and what do you want to measure? If you want to measure efficiency, well, then you're going to have to think about the bundle as exclusivity, and, well, of course, you're going to be a mainstream law and economic person and maybe a conservative. But you could very well do distributional analysis in a totally different way. And try, for example, to see how property is distributing capabilities, potentia, the thing that Negri and Hart really love. So what I'm just saying is that the idea that the bundle of rights thing could be associated with a certain type of theory, and that moreover it would be possible to give it a political valence, does really not make sense. So I want to now go into a concrete example of that, which is the example of the copyleft. And here too, Negri and Hart are discussing the Creative Commons, and they understand it as a nice thing, which is giving, I quote, limited control over the cultural products of the producers of immaterial creations. I hear too things that they totally miss the point. And first, the copyleft, which is the legal engine for Creative Commons, but at the beginning that was for free license, the GNU license, and then it has been expanded to what became Creative Commons. So the first thing to say is that it's a classical copyright. And here I repeat because it's really important in the discussion, it's a classical copyright, it's a right of property. If there's no copyright, there's no copyleft. And it's just a property right associated with another horrible thing, which is a membership agreement. You know, I agree. These horrible contracts that are not giving any chance to the other party to negotiate the terms of the contract, and that ordinarily we left legal theorists hate. But the conjecture of these two things produces the so-called free license. And it's free because it allows the four freedom, which is access, use, study, and run. And one forbidding, interdiction, one prohibition, which is the prohibition to put the derivatives of the software that will be produced through the free access and the free use under another license. So technically, the owner of the first software has a right to exclude or to include. Make the choice to include and to license its copyright or her copyright with a free license, which means that the owner of the derivative is an owner, has a full copyright, a right of property, but with no right to exclude. So that is a property without exclusivity. That is a property without exclusion. That is an inclusive property. So the idea that there would be a core of exclusivity in property, well, actually, no. So going back to the general element capitalism, property, exclusivity, I would say, one, yes, it's maybe true that in order to accumulate capital, there is a need of exclusivity. I wouldn't say that in the social relation of work, all the surplus value has to go only in one direction. But there are obviously mechanisms of capture of surplus value that are needed for the extended reproduction of capital. But my first objection to that is sometimes it's not property. Don't only focus on property. Shareholders, that's not a property right. That's contract. So if you only look at property, you're missing a lot of things. So one, all exclusive mechanisms are not related to property. Second, property is not always exclusive. That's what I tried to explain with the Copyleft example. Third, all mechanisms of exclusivity are not all associated with the accumulation of capital. And if, like Negri and Art do agree with, individual possessions are not part of the discussion, well, it could be very good that these individual possessions be protected from, say, capture from the capital or the state, from dispossession. Some exclusivity tools are actually really good and really emancipatory. So, in a nutshell, there's no necessary link between property, exclusivity, capitalism. And that means that in the language of law, things can be really flippable and can go in many directions. And no, in that discussion, the language of law and the language of property is not the weapon of the master. It's the playground. And we should learn how to play those with those words because it's interesting. I think I'm going to stop here. Yeah.
Etienne, tu veux prendre le micro?
Is that enough like that? Can you hear me or does it have to be closer?
I think it's not on.
Closer?
And it's not on.
Yes,
Green.
then
Yeah.
caught in the same. Okay, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here tonight. Thank Bernard, thank the whole team of the seminar. I will readily apologize for different things. First, I'm not a legal theorist. I don't know if I'm a philosopher, but I'm not a legal theorist. And that will be only to manifest in probably the insufficiencies of some of my reflections. Second, I am in the second day of the annual cold, which destroys you completely for normally 3 days. Yeah? And therefore, I'm not really able to improvise an elegant response to what Mikhaïl I remember at the times of the fall of the Soviet Union, when the French journalists wanted to name Gorbachev with the right pronunciation of his first name, they would say Michael Gorbachev. Okay, so I will read from the text that he's already circulating, and therefore for some of you there will be nothing new. The idea of no outside is pleaded for by Mikhaïl in a subtle manner. He doesn't say that everything, every action or social relation is legally codified, but he says more dialectically that it is always the law itself that identifies or delimitates its other or its remainder. As a consequence, any critique of the established order which aims at transforming the totality must address the dominant term which sets the rules of the game, and this is law itself. There are two possible ways of presenting this idea. A weak version, which probably Marx himself would not reject, would run like this. Every action or social relation is always represented or codified in juridical legal terms. Not only this version does not involve that critique will be legal itself, on the contrary, it seems to call for a removal of the legal representation in the first place in order to tackle the thing itself. But we have to do here with a strong version whereby legal forms are constitutive of all social practices, so that a critique can only work through their contradictions and conflicts. To this second interpretation, which I believe is Mikhaïl's point of view, I would like to add a complement which is not there in his argument, because he's so focused on the question of legal critique and critique of the law, but which I hope he will not reject. This is the striking parallelism between the discussions about law and the discussions about political economy. It could be argued in a very similar manner that the economy has no outside, and this would pose the same dilemma for the idea of critique. Immanent critique that remains inside the economic logic or grammar, or external critique that believes to be able to identify a subversive non-economic factor, for instance the labor force, the proletariat itself, or even the common in Hart and Negri's understanding. This parallel, it seems to me, is all the more interesting because we want to discuss not law in general, but the law of property, or property as the foundation of a certain juridical order. Property, in fact, is the hybrid category or boundary concept that in modern times has articulated law and economy, or translated one grammar into the other. I conclude that Mikhaïl had a very strong argument, especially if he agreed to take into account an economic complement. This would not amount to make, you've already said, this would not amount to make the economy an outside of the law, however, returning to the representation where law is just an instrument or a representation for something else. On the contrary, it would suggest that law and economy are coextensive and mutually constitutive. Let us note that this is not very different from what Hart and Negri call the Republic of Property in its general sense, but it is also not incompatible with much of what Duncan Kennedy and the Critical Legal Studies School seem to do in practice, if I well understand. Therefore, it strengthens Mikhaïl's critique without necessarily destroying all of Hart and Negri's perspective. Yes, but logically speaking, Mikhaïl's argument of the no outside seems to me to rely, this is nasty, on a very Aristotelian use of the negation and the negation of the negation. This is where the problem of topology comes, what I call topology, comes into play. To explain that nothing is outside the realm of the law, if only by implication, leads to the conclusion that everything is within the realm of the law, or must take a legal form, or act legally, only if not A equal A. In other terms, if there exists nothing that, while not lying outside the legal realm, can nevertheless be non-legal, heterogeneous with respect to the legal forms, as a kind of internal exclusion, or internal otherness. How if, in fact, the possibility of critique rested precisely on that counterintuitive possibility, that is, the discovery of a topology where the interior and the exterior are not counterposed in such a simple manner? I believe that this is crucial both for the understanding of critique and its aporias in general, and for the discussion about the critical use of law. On the side of critique, it seems to me that we could say that the problem was always the same, to twist immanence so that something heterogeneous, irreducible to the existing order, conditions, tendencies, even transformations, emerges from inside, not being imported or revealed from above or from outside. And on the side of the critical use of law, this seems to be the whole question whether you can pass from something like a legal defense of the people and the interest, even the principles that the legal order in its massive injustice crushes or destroys or subjugates, to something like a legal subversion with perhaps in the middle a counter law, a contre-droit, which at some point not only makes use of what Mikhaïl calls the flexibility or the variability of the legal language, but amounts to changing the rules themselves, the grammar of or the language game. I would very much agree with the idea that the fate of the idea of critique in this moment, the possibility of renewing our philosophical understanding of the question of immanent heterogeneity, you may call it revolution, directly depends on our capacity to find a critical use and even meaning for the law, because we have come to realize that capitalism is constituted as a legal order as much as an economic order. Again, Hart and Negri's Republic of Property seems to be meaning exactly that. However, it would seem that the aporia is very real because, to put it brutally, whereas Mikhaïl often gives the impression that his examples, Copyleft, etc., are examples of intra-capitalist reforms, Hart and Negri on their side give the impression that they resolve the problems through a utopian leap into the imagination of a kingdom of democracy and commonality where conflicts are suppressed because capitalism has already collapsed. But it is very interesting that in their new development in Assembly, they direct their critique at precisely what supports Mikhaïl's argument for the critical effectivity of legal practice, namely the reforms and transformation of property which push the legal grammar to its extreme possibilities. Second, the strength of Mikhaïl's position is that he describes the realm of law as a field of generalized conflict, therefore permanent relations or relationships of forces. Conflict and law are no longer opposites. They are, in fact, inseparable. However, this raises several questions, which are probably, particularly two, which are probably the two faces of the same question. First, are there different orders or levels of conflict? More precisely, are there conflicts which are waged within the existing rules, which we might call litigations, and others whose stakes are the rules themselves, what in a not so distant past epistemologists called a change of paradigm? And second, if such conflicts of the second order exist, which are the forces or the combination of forces that in a given situation will make it possible to cross the threshold, rise from the interpretation of the rules to their very change? Is that the Supreme Court, or the political movements, or the social classes? It seems that, in fact, we're back to the question of the topology from a more practical point of view. And I'm tempted to say, having in mind such issues in the recent past, or more or less recent past, as civil rights, abortion, social legislation, etc., the force is a non-legal combination of legal agents and actions, but this is just a formula. This is not the place to examine, of course, in all its details, the current debate on the idea of the new commons, both from without and from within the communist tendency to which Hart and Negri, but also their rivals, Dardot and Laval, whose book is soon to appear in English, undoubtedly belong. I want to remain within the range of questions which arise from the virtual dialogue between Hart and Negri and Xifaras. Let me begin by, this is my last point, by returning to the question of reformism versus revolution, stressing the fact that nevertheless their perspectives are in good part convergent. At least they agree in the identification of a strategic field in which the imposition of a concept of property as absolute subjective right granted to individuals is rapidly becoming incompatible with both technological possibilities and social tendencies. This would be the field of intellectual property and the exchange of immaterial instruments of learning or innovation, which are both reproducible and variable in real time through their collective uses. However, their genealogies of the conflictual situation arising within the economic legal order seem to be diametrically opposed. This is where, in particular, and I refer, of course, to the long version of Mikhaïl's paper, the introduction of Hart and Negri's more recent chapter from Assembly brings some greater clarity. Hart and Negri and Mikhaïl Xifaras roughly identify a similar origin for the vicissitudes of a property right, whose fundamental substance is the exclusion of others from the use or the administration of a property which is in the end identified with a thing. This origin is to be identified with the classical moment in which modern capitalism becomes the dominant mode of production in our northern Western societies. Therefore, it also coincides with the bourgeois revolutions which imposed legal systems where the protection of private property was established as the cornerstone of the whole social edifice and the prototype of all so-called subjective rights. From this origin, however, they draw opposite lines into the present. I simplify, but let's say that for Xifaras, the evolution is a continuous deviation from that origin, which in the end will be completely forgotten or become meaningless. This can be summarized with the idea that property is less and less substantial and becoming more and more relational, that is, incorporating in its definition limitations, dependencies, capacities distributed over a plurality of subjects who may very well be conflicting subjects. Philosophers are, and especially Marxist philosophers, are mostly unaware of this transformation that has taken place in the last century at least. But it has in fact changed the content while keeping the name, and this is what brings to the threshold of a situation in which property will play a role which can no longer really appear as private. On the contrary, for Hart and Negri, the evolution is one that essentially preserves the same law of property while constantly modifying its modalities of application and its ideological justifications according to technological changes and political reforms. There would be, therefore, an invariant in all the changes, and this invariant, the bourgeois capitalist mode of production, of which the legal forms are expressions and instruments, not real transformations. What is likely to bring about a real change, therefore, is the fact that the legal form, even if constantly changing in detail to adapt to the new cultural environment, has become increasingly artificial compared to the social character of labor and more generally activity, because in particular it is increasingly intellectualized. It's more complicated because for them it's both intellectualized and becoming also of the order of the effects, but I leave that aside. This change will not take the form of a new legal regime of property. It will take the form of a farewell to property in general, whether private or public, which is incompatible with the emancipation of the common. It is not my intention to try and produce a balance sheet of judgment on these antithetic discourses. I want rather to display some of their political and historical implications. I believe that Mikhaïl Xifaras would be ready to admit that the likely effect of social and technological changes which make exclusive appropriation increasingly difficult, if not impossible, in the realm of immaterial production is not a simple evolution towards socialized or cooperative forms of use where the diversity of legal prerogatives will find a renewed application. It is rather an acute conflict fought on economic as well as legal terrain between opposite transformations of the law of property, whereby, in particular, capitalist corporations tend to shift the point of application of their exclusive right from one level, one type of objects or actions or interactions to another, which commands the use of the former or controls its circulation, as we see today with platforms, Uber, Facebook, etc. And I'm tempted to ask, is it not the typical form in which, as Mikhaïl indicates, the neoliberal revolution has produced the return of property or the reprivatization of the commons, the social property, etc., albeit, of course, not in the form of a return of the same? If such a conflict exists, it will also indicate why Negri and Hart are wrong in believing that however violent the resistance of private property against the historical tendency towards socialization, it will remain a rearguard fight which creates nothing new in history, because from their point of view, the new should be entirely on the side of the multitudes and never on the side of capital. To this, we can add another strong point in Mikhaïl's argument, which concerns the institution of the common, including its legal forms, therefore not the present, but the future to come. This is the idea that more than ever, an institution of the common will need a juridical system of categories and rules, because it will need to regulate the distribution of moments, activities, and use values between the collective and the proper. This amounts to anticipating a meta level in the definition of property, which essentially has an ethical or anthropological function, but which must be formulated in the language of law or in a legal grammar. One has to admit that on this point, Negri and Hart seem to simply produce an act of faith in the virtues of democracy and even mutual love among humans, which cannot not prevail when the oppressive weight of capitalist disposition is lifted. On the other hand, and I finish with that, it seems that with all his insistence on the conflictual nature of legal transformations or bifurcations, Mikhaïl is not very concerned with the processes of appropriation and expropriation, which are the other side of every use of the category property, whether subjective or relational, not outside the law, but on the economic, what I call the economic side of the law, or the economic other side of the law. Hart and Negri push this articulation, of course, to the extreme. That is, they explain that property is always just a name for expropriation. This idea is profoundly rooted in their book and in their work in general in a strange but highly revealing character of their genealogy, which comes from the fact that in their explicit reference, with a few exceptions, regarding the constitution of the Republic of Property, it is the bourgeois, whereas the explicit reference is the bourgeois revolution of the classical age, the implicit reference is a Franciscan opposition of property and poverty, more precisely dominium and usus, which is of course communist but pre-bourgeois. So that's why I insisted on putting the extraordinary chapter by Janet Coleman on the reading list. My feeling is that while Hart and Negri seem or believe to be discussing a story that begins with classical definitions of property and leads to the new commons of the age of communications, they are in fact reenacting the medieval conflict between the Dominicans and the Franciscans, to which, unsurprisingly, they grant an eschatological function. On his side, Mikhaïl Xifaras is right to insist on the fact that property has a history, therefore its transformation cannot be imagined independent of its past and ongoing tendencies of change, but he's apparently interested exclusively in the modern history, the bourgeois history, which is purely secular, not in the fact that there is a pre-modern theological history, no less juridical for that, which remains a determinant of our present, particularly when it comes to the normative foundations of individualism. Perhaps it is not too absurd to ask the question, where would Marx stand in such a discussion? I'm interested in the fact that he, in fact, combines three different discourses at least. One is a representation of the perpetual war fought in the field of the organization of labor individually and collectively, which has a legal face as well as an economic one. Labor Day, distribution of value, etc. This is absolutely compatible with Mikhaïl Xifaras' representation of conflict in the legal language, provided we admit that it has a substance provided by the economy. Another discourse is eschatological, and although it is not fought in the name of poverty as such, it rejoins the idea that capitalist appropriation can only become suppressed through a complete reversal of its principle, the famous expropriation of the expropriators. But the most interesting for our discussion, perhaps, is the third one, because it is more technical. This is the idea that profits and surplus value are distributed among different classes of proprietors according to their mode of appropriation over the means of production and several modalities of contract and credit, something that seems to me not so far from a certain, could be perhaps named a bundle of rights. And above all, that the continuity of the process of accumulation is made possible by the fact that the surplus value can be appropriated on one side only of the social relation of production, the 1%, if you like. This means that an exclusive owner is needed, although this owner is not necessarily an individual. It is any entity which bears the title of property. And I'm very surprised that you say that shareholders are not properties. You'll have to explain that to me.
They are, but
This leads Marx to explaining, okay, leads Marx to explaining that the monetary capital after a sufficient number of productive cycles is entirely composed of unpaid surplus labor, but this is not a theft, because the appropriation has continuously taken place according to the law of property. It seems to go in the direction not of an invariant right, but of an irreducible core of exclusion inherent in every form of property that is compatible with capitalism. This was also the question that I was asking when interpreting the return to property in the neoliberal era as a transposition or transference of the means of control of the profitable activities onto a different level. Therefore, it takes me back to the question abstractly asked in my first part: which forces or political combination of forces are likely to legally displace the point of absolute resistance to socialization that is present in every capitalist regime of property, however transformed with respect to the classical and pre-classical dominium. I have no doubt that, as Mikhaïl Xifaras explains, a new legal imaginary is required for that, which is a cultural phenomenon, but the legal imaginary must also become a material force, in Marx's words from 1844. One traditional answer was the state. Another traditional answer was the mass, or the multitude, or the proletariat. Fusing the two gave the state in the hands of the proletariat. We seem to be in the search of new proposals.
Merci, Etienne. Camille.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Bernard for the invitation. I'm also losing my voice like Etienne, so I'm going to see how long this lasts. But thank you for these really interesting papers and interventions. So I'm going to take us somewhere differently, away from property and the economy to the unconscious. But I'm also interested in this idea of institutions that came up in the two papers and what institutes institutions, basically. So, and part of it is I want to do this through a dialogue between Dardot and Laval and Hart and Negri, partly because until about 2 weeks ago I thought we were discussing this book, my unconscious, and thankfully Etienne put me on the right path.
And then we realized it has not been translated in English yet.
It's coming, it's coming.
It's coming,
Oh.
but you know, as a result, that's what I was thinking. But I do think it will open up some questions, at least, that I'm interested in. So I did eventually get Hart and Negri, and I'll say a few words about that before I turn to some more general questions. So in their preface to Commonwealth, Hart and Negri described their book as, quote, an ethical project, an ethics of democratic political action within and against empire. Their goal, they explain, is not simply to recognize the movements and the practices of the multitude that have been able to resist empire, capital, and neoliberalism. More ambitiously, they want to provide a new political theory, a political manual in the Machiavellian tradition that will help these movements endure through time. And they call this becoming prince. So becoming prince, they say, is the process of the multitude learning the art of self-rule and inventing lasting democratic forms of social organization. The argument that follows in their book proceeds in 3 steps. In the first part of the book, Hart and Negri investigate various frameworks, the Republic, modernity, and capital, that have, historically but also conceptually, obstructed or corrupted the development of a common. In the second part of the book, they explore contemporary possibilities for this common. Finally, they end with some reflections on what the revolution that would bring about this common could look like and what institutional processes it would require. So since Etienne and Mikhaïl have focused on the first part of the book on the intertwining of law and capital, I want to turn to the end of the book, to Hart and Negri's discussion of revolution. My first hope is to elucidate what these authors mean by institutions and to better understand why these are so central to their political project. Secondly, I want to put Hart and Negri in conversation with Dardo and Laval, since I read them, but also with institutional psychotherapy, a form of radical psychiatry that emerged in France in the second half of the 20th century, and that is the subject of the book that I'm currently writing. So what I want to suggest is that instead of turning to Kant as they do at the beginning of Commonwealth, and they do say it's a kind of critical Kant, Kant read against the grain, Hart and Negri could have found some theoretical solace in the notions of the unconscious, group transference, and the collective put forth by institutional psychotherapy. Notions that were originally inspired by Freud, Marx, Lacan, but reworked by various thinkers who were deeply marked by this movement, and this include François Toscaïès, Jean Houry, France Fanon, and Félix Guattari. So it was interesting to me that that Commonwealth, which is a book that is so Deleuzian in many ways, and I think it's a genealogy that Hart and Negri would happily claim, and yet the absence of institutional psychotherapy, which was extremely important for Deleuze and Guattari. It's hard, for example, to read Anti-Oedipus without knowing what Guattari was doing at Laborde, and I'll tell you about this in a second. But anyway, I think this dialogue could have provided some interesting answers to some of their central philosophical questions. So first, why are institutions so central for Hart and Negri? As they reiterate throughout their book, the common should not be reduced to a thing. The point is not to take over the state apparatus or to acquire the means of production. Insurrection, they write, should not be confused with a coup d'etat, which merely replaces the existing state institutions with comparable homologous ones. And so I'm citing here. In order to open the path for revolution, institutions must be sustained and consolidated in an institutional process. Insurrection needs institutions, but institutions that they say have to be of a different sort. And so, unlike the social contract tradition within social theory, and they call this the major line, which considers institutions as mechanisms to solidify order and identities, Hart and Negri are interested in what they call a minor line of social theory that places social conflict at the basis of institutions, a genealogy that they trace back to Machiavelli and Spinoza. If institutions are conceived along this major line, insurrection will inevitably fail because it will be faced with an impasse. On the one hand, and I'm quoting them here, revolts and rebellions that fail to develop institutional continuity are quickly covered and absorbed within the dominant order. On the other hand, when you enter into a dominant form of institution, which is based in identity, functions through representation and demands unity and concord, serves to neutralize the social rupture opened up by revolt. So there's these kind of two poles. However, Hart and Negri contend an institutional process based in conflict, according to the minor line, can consolidate insurrection without negating its force of rupture and power. The key, they argue, is to discover in each case and the extent to which the institutional process does not negate the social rupture created by the revolt, but extends and develops it. After setting up these preliminaries, Hart and Negri offer us new definitions of institutions. So they have three definitions. First, they say institutions are based on conflict in the sense that they both extend the social rupture operated by revolt against the ruling powers and are open to internal discord. Second, institutions consolidate collective habits, practices, and capacities that designate a form of life. Third, and finally, institutions are open-ended in that they are continually transformed by the singularities that compose them. This understanding of institutions, Hart and Negri tell us, is different from the classical sociological one, which begins with the individuals and ends with identity. In contrast, Hart and Negri propose to start with what they call singularities, perpetually in flux, open in conflict with power, but in conflict with power, but also in conflict with one another. Their notion of institution is also different from the legal or political scientific one, where institutions must serve as the foundation for the constituted power, that is, the constitutional order of sovereignty. And I guess this is what Mikhaïl was contesting. Their notion of law is very rigid. For them, institutions form constituent rather than constituted power. In conclusion, Hart and Negri write, the institutional process provides a mechanism of protection, but with no guarantees, against the two primary dangers facing the multitude. Externally, the repression of the ruling power, and internally, the destructive conflicts among the singularities within the multitude. Revolution is thus the process that extends insurrection into an institutional process, and as such, that transforms the fabric of social being. That, it seems to me, is what Hart and Negri mean by the common, a political mode geared towards creation, towards futurity, and ethics that as they claim at the beginning of their book. So in their 2014 work, Commun, Pierre Dardot and Christian Laval return to the problem of the common, and in this context they engage but also depart from Hart and Negri. More specifically, they argue with Hart and Negri's understanding of revolution, which they claim needs to ultimately give rise to to a constitutional process. Turning to Castoriadis, and especially to his concept of the imaginary, Dardot and Laval privilege the idea of an instituting power. They call it, I don't know if instituting is the right word, but pouvoir instituant, that they oppose to a constituting power, a pouvoir constituant. And this idea of an instituting power allows them to link praxis to creation, and ultimately to contend that the institution itself is always already praxis and needs to be constantly renewed, rethought. And I think this links also nicely to the theme of the seminar of how praxis comes in. So as they put it, and I'm quoting them here, the instituting praxis is at the same time the action that establishes a new system of rules and the action that seeks to constantly relaunch this establishment in order to avoid the collapse of the instituting into the instituted. The instituting praxis, they continue, produces its own subject in the continuity with an exercise that needs to constantly be renewed beyond the creative act. More exactly, it is the self-production of a collective subject in and through the continuous co-production of rules of law. And it is at this point in their argument that Dardot and Laval turned to institutional psychotherapy. And I sort of came around this after I was writing my book, but it's very interesting because in my own thoughts, I had thought of institutional psychotherapy as a common, so I'm glad I'm not the only person who had thought about this. So as an example, basically, of how this kind of instituting praxis what it could look like practically speaking, right? So what is institutional psychotherapy? Institutional psychotherapy was developed in the psychiatric hospital of Saint-Alban, a remote village in central France during the Second World War. The context of the war brought together to this hospital several politically engaged psychiatrists who were interested in reconciling Marx and Freud, but also who were early readers of Lacan. It also brought together intellectuals and artists who were fleeing fascism, so the poet Paul Éluard, for example, others who were fighting in the resistance, such as the historian of science Georges Canguilhem, and others. François Tosquelles, who was perhaps the most important theorist of institutional psychotherapy and a mentor to many, including Fanon, this is very clear in the recently published psychiatric text where Fanon is always kind of paying tribute to Tosquelles. So Tosquelles was a Catalan-born psychiatrist and one of the founder of the POUM, the anarchist-inspired and anti-Stalinist leftist movement that flourished in the Barcelona of the 1930s. Tosquelles liked to repeat that in the course of his life, he had been exposed to multiple physical and ideological occupations. First, as a Catalan citizen fighting against what he saw as Spanish imperialism. Second, as an activist in the POUM, trying to struggle against Stalinist domination. Third, as an opponent of fascism, first in Spain and later in the resistance in Vichy, France. And finally, as a refugee who was incarcerated in the deplorable conditions of French concentration camps. These various experiences had rendered him particularly sensitive to the dangers of concentrationism, what he called le tout pouvoir. Concentrationism, what he defined as concentrationism, was the potential of any institution or any group to become authoritarian, oppressive, discriminatory, and exclusionary. As the war had made clear, concentrationism threatened not only our social and political organization, it was also a behavior, a psychic disposition. Alienation, as he put it, was always social and psychic at once. So disalienation also had to work on both fronts. And this is why Tosquelles referred to Marx and Freud as the two legs of institutional psychotherapy. When one walked, the other had to follow. It is at this crossroad of Marxism and psychoanalysis that institutional psychotherapy was born as a tool to diagnose but also to fight against this double alienation. Because institutional psychotherapy never sought to become a totalizing philosophy, it is difficult to pinpoint a general model or method. However, its practitioners did rely on a couple of key texts and basic principles. Among these was the belief that theory and practice were inextricably linked. As Tosquelles and his colleagues had realized from their medical training, much of the problem with psychiatry, the psychiatry that they had encountered in their medical school, mainstream psychiatry mainstream psychiatry still considered psychosis as an exclusively neurological phenomenon located and locatable on the brain, and the field as a whole, psychiatry, remained very hostile to insights from the social and human sciences, especially from psychoanalysis. On the other hand, most of Freudian psychoanalysis had concluded that psychosis was really outside its realm of competence. As the practitioners of institutional psychotherapy observed, however, psychotics could indeed have transferential relations, but these were not one-on-one, not intersubjective, as it was the case with neurosis. They were collective. Social relations thus offered a privileged lens to observe the operations of the psychotic unconscious, to analyze the projection of desires and fantasies, to study identifications, and to eventually try to work with them. So these were the theoretical premises that guided Tosquelles and his colleagues at Saint-Alban as they set up very concrete practices that would favor this transferential constellation. So for example, and it's kind of the practical aspects of it that interest me in conversation with the theory, group therapies, general meetings, self-managed unions of patients, ergotherapy workshops such as printing, binding, woodwork, pottery, libraries, publications, and a wide range of cultural activities, such as movies, concerts, and theater. The idea was to constantly imagine and reimagine institutions that would produce new vectors of transference, different forms of identifications, and alternative social relations. Every hands-on experiment had a therapeutic purpose, and every therapeutic intervention was also grounded in the practice, all in the hope of disalienating not only the patients but the collectivity of a whole, but also to produce, I think, what they don't use the term, but it was a new common. They say a new social, but it's similar, I think, to what this common that these guys are talking about. Institutional psychotherapy was reworked, as I said, by many important thinkers, including Frantz Fanon, who, after his medical residency, who was a resident at Saint-Alban in 1952 and 1953, and went to North Africa, first to Algeria, then to Tunisia, where he implemented many of these practices in the clinics where he worked, practices that were intimately linked to his anti-colonial activism. It was also very important for Jean Houry, who in 1953 founded the Clinic of Laborde, where Guattari worked for many years. Laborde fundamentally shaped Guattari's philosophy from Anti-Oedipus, which Michel Foucault described as a book of ethics. So I think there's a kind of, again, this idea of an ethics rooted in praxis that runs throughout both projects here. To his work on transversality, on subject groups, groupe sujet, for example, versus groupe assujetti, to his activism at the CERFI, for example. So one of the things that they were doing at Laborde, which Guattari tried to use socially in his more social theory, was that they had a grid called la grille, where everybody had tasks during the day, for example, cleaning up the kitchen, doing the beds, washing the clothes. And the idea is that this would constantly rotate so that you wouldn't get fixated on a fixed role, like you wouldn't be stuck on a fixed role. So how would that work out socially? Again, the idea is not to avoid conflict, because conflict exists, but to figure out how to bring out this conflict and work with it. So we can see why Dardot and Laval would be interested in institutional psychotherapy as embodying this kind of instituting praxis that could produce a new form of common or collectif, to use Houry's term. But perhaps institutional psychotherapy could also help Hart and Negri if we consider it not again as a medical or therapeutical practice, but as a political theory, as an ethics and a practice of everyday life that would prevent the reappearance of these political and psychic concentrationisms. So basically, I think instead of trying to find these institutions in the social immanently, as Hart and Negri want to do, I think, the idea here is that you would need to produce this. You would need to produce the social again and again, constantly, and not find it, but make it. As Tosquelles put it, institutional psychotherapy was an attempt to cure not the patients, not only the doctors, but really an attempt to cure life. And this seems like any preliminary step, like a necessary preliminary step to any discussion of the commons. Thank you.
Thank you, Camille. Okay, so before I open up first with Katharina Pistor the conversation, I wanted to start with just some reflections on the three presentations and the three contributions. A quick reflection. In part because I find myself unable to not intervene because of having spent so many years myself in this debate. Yes. So, and what I would want to suggest, and the other thing I should say is, in this seminar series, one of the things we've decided to do was not to bring the authors here because of the fact that it would create a certain defensiveness or a bad dynamic, I think. Therefore, that's why we're reading all these texts without the authors present. I often find myself, though, defending the texts. Yes?
Michael Hart is not here, but he's very interested.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
He's played a wonderfully friendly
yes.
Role
in
making everything possible.
Yes.
I had turned to him.
Yeah.
You seem to have addressed blah blah, and he gave me all the indications, and he wrote very friendly.
Right. Yeah. So they are here virtually, but not here physically. But one of the things that produces is that I often find myself actually defending the authors. But in this case, I don't think that's necessary, because what I really feel in this conversation is that there is enough theoretical agreement and overlap. Enough theoretical agreement and overlap actually between us, between you, Mikhaïl, and Etienne and Camille in terms of the institutional side, and Hart and Negri, to think that the real stakes of this debate are not so much at the theoretical disagreement level, but at another level, and at a level that I would say of praxis. And what I mean by that is the following. I think we all agree, first, in your central thesis, Mikhaïl, that the law is malleable and can be shaped internally, and can be twisted and pushed into directions that that are radical, right or left, right? And I think that, for instance, when we spend our time looking at other readings, even perhaps the new right readings or the counter-revolutionary readings, we see the way in which the law can be twisted towards a rule of law that embraces summary executions in this country of Americans abroad, that embraces indefinite detention, all of which complies fully with a conception of due process, right? So, and I don't think that Hart and Negri would disagree with that, and I think in part we all agree that there is infinite malleability. Well, the adjective infinite maybe we might not all agree on, but I certainly believe that there's infinite malleability to the law, and so on that, theoretically, I think we all agree. On a second point, I think that we also tend to agree that there really isn't a space that is not regulated. I don't read Hart and Negri as suggesting that the space beyond, now, I do think that there are differences in usage of language, and I'll come to that in a second, that might make us literally see something as something beyond property. But it's not a space that is unregulated. It's a space that's regulated by democratic processes, that would be managed by democratic processes. In other words, the idea of the common that Hardt and Negri have is of a space ultimately that is managed. Now, and whether we call that juridical management or democratic management, I think that's an emphasis. That's an emphasis on a particular dimension of the management of that space. But it is ultimately going to be a space that is juridically managed. So in other words, when in assembly, for instance, on page 97, when Hardt and Negri write, the common is defined first, then in contrast to property, both private and public. It is not a new form of property, but rather non-property. My sense is that this may be the just generosity of reading, is not to claim really that we have gone beyond a legal form to a space that is no longer juridical, but that we have moved from a conception of private property and a conception of state-owned property, different earlier conceptions of property, to a different way in which things are regulated, their use is regulated. I think that there's a slight difference in the expressions and the texture of the way it's written, but I think that it's not theoretically, substantively far from a conception of a juridical space that would be regulated through democratic processes, such that things would be used in the ways that are in common and regulated by us. And the third thing that I think we would all agree with is, and of course, in that regulatory mechanism, then we would want to think about institutional design, as Camille was talking about. The third thing that I think we all would agree on is that Etienne's intervention, namely that there are other constitutive elements to social reality. One of them is law, of course, and for us who have been trained in critical legal studies, of course, we see the constitutive nature of law. Etienne wanted to say there would be a complement, the economic constitutive nature of social reality, which you agreed with, which we all agree with. So in other words, social reality is constituted by these multiple dimensions. Now, if we agree with all of that, and particularly with the last point, right, that there are mutually constitutive dimensions, then I think that the real stakes is not at this theoretical level, but at the level of kind of what we are going to privilege and prioritize in the social transformation that we are trying to achieve, in the reform/revolution. And what I hear the dispute being ultimately is one where Hardt and Negri are suggesting that what we privilege is the multitude and the democratic processes that would bring about new forms of usage and shared space, versus the question of whether it's going to primarily come from inside the law, through lawyers, possibly. And it's there where I think if that is the true stake of the debate, and so we'll have to figure this out, but if that is the true stake of the debate, then I think that it's unlikely that radical social transformation is going to come from internally, from within the legal profession, within the elite, private, critical lawyers, and simply because of what I would say is simply because of the political economy of big law, in a sense. And so that's the kind of way in which one can think about this as being a theory of big law. Law is everywhere, but also there being a problem with big law in its other sense, the big law firms, et cetera, and the reality of corporate dominance of the legal field, such that the problem with a big law theory is the political economy of big law. right? But I think that ultimately what we need to resolve here is less the slight differences in the grammar of the common than in the privileging of what it is that should be privileged in trying to make that common happen. And in that sense, I tend to gravitate more towards the critical theory than towards the critical legal theory. Right? So that would be one question to open it up. Katharina, Pistor.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for inviting me to join you here. I come less from a theoretical perspective, but more from the practical, which is, I guess, why you invited me to this seminar. So your comments are a nice segue in my thoughts on the discussion and some of the readings. And that, I think, is the first question that came to my mind when I was listening to Mikhaïl again, when he talked about the masters. And I said, well, who are the masters? So one way to think about the masters is the lawyers, right? Not the asset holders. So I call the lawyers, the big law lawyers, the masters of the legal code of capital. Because capital is coded in law, and the master coders for 400 years have used very similar types of institutions, but that do something to code capital, and as Etienne suggested, different types of assets as capital. It can be land, it can be firms like asset pools, it can be debt, it can be ideas, it can be even nature's code itself that we can code in certain ways. And property rights have been one of them, but I would add others, and I would add others basically on a higher level abstraction. I would say what capital needs in comparison to other assets. So if you can flip any asset into a capital asset if you want, but you have to give them some kind of priority rights over competing claims, or the holders priority rights over priority over competing claims. The second is durability, greater durability in life than anybody else, which is contrary to the market principle. It's not only competitiveness, but it's legal steroids to be a little bit more competitive. The option to convert your claim into state money, especially for the more fluid financial assets. So for financial assets, convertibility is more important than durability, and then all of that, and that's critical, and that's, I think, missing in the discussion. It has to be universally enforceable, and for that you need a state. And so I think what is important here to realize is that the ability of the master coders to do what they do is contingent on state power. But I think what we also have to bring in, and when we think about sort of who is doing it, is that we have to do this on the back of state power, on the ability to make these claims that we create, these priority claims, durability complaints, convertible and universality complaints. We have to make them basically enforceable anywhere. And in our global situation, I think that complicates things really. It's that lawyers have been able to pick and choose the laws under which they wish to code capital, and states have committed to enforce whatever has been coded through a subset of legal structures, which include conflict of law rules, which include some harmonization, which includes sort of the widespread use of arbitration, and then an international convention that forces states to basically lease their coercive powers of enforcement to the private claims that will be enforced by their courts of law without any second thoughts on the merits. So I think what I want to say is that the legal aspect of this is tied to a particular manifestation of of coercion, and that's not only the top-down state. It's not only sort of one system of rules that we're talking about, but it's basically the institutionalization of coercive power that allows private parties to opt into it, and not only opt into their own domestic coercive powers, but opt into foreign coercive powers, or to opt into foreign law and still have their own state use the coercive powers to enforce it, even though it might not be compatible with local rules. So that, I think, is critical to understand, to see why it's so difficult to reform the system from within. So I think if we go back to the question, you know, who gets to decide? Who gets to decide the priorities? So you could ask, if you can flip, this is basically what I'm arguing in my own book project, if you can flip any asset into a capital asset, who decides which ones can be will be flipped, right? So why is it land at a certain point in time, and why is it so different in different countries at different points in time? Why is it intellectual property, and how does it happen, I think we have to understand the close relationship, is it like a kind of a triangle between big law, a particular manifestation of state power, which includes sort of this ability to access it for private law enforcement, and of course the clients that have a particular relationship to either or both the state and the lawyers.
Thank you. Katharina. Camila, do you want to say a word? Yeah, because I was just reading your chapter, which was entirely on critical legal studies and Pushikanis, so I thought, you know.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about that though. So I want to say something about interpretation because it bears on Praxis so much in this book. I want to talk about the interpretation of, especially Negri, of Machiavelli, and how this kind of radical democratic interpretation of Machiavelli doesn't serve really the project that they're putting forward. Because they cannot escape the kind of the absolute will of the multitude and the autopoietic kind of self-constituted nature of the multitude. And this is that kind of the paradox they put forward. So how the multitude needs to constitute itself, to institute itself democratically. How do we do that? Because if, as Hart and Negri say, the people are wedded to hierarchy, identities, and corrupt forms of life, how is there possible that the same people who are already embedded in these corrupt institutional forms can constitute themselves democratically and create these democratic procedures? So it's a paradox that cannot be resolved through democratic theory and the radical interpretation of Machiavelli through democracy. Because the problem is that Hart and Negri are connecting means and ends. So for them, you can only constitute the multitude democratically, right? So without democratic means, you do not have democratic ends. And if we read Machiavelli, he actually says the opposite. So basically, Machiavelli departs from Aristotle, saying means and ends are not necessarily connected. And actually, he says, he never, ever says that the multitude can constitute itself. Never says that the multitude is going to constitute the foundation of freedom. It's actually the prince, and it's actually an authoritarian action. So it is, for him, the multitude can operate democratically, but already from within an institutional framework that allows for democratic practices. So I would argue that this kind of autopoietic constitution of the multitude is actually disempowering, because we can never get there, right? We need to, and I think Etienne is very clear in this, that we need to create this kind of popular infrastructure in order to institute the multitude. And then I have the other kind of quibble with the definition of institution for Hart and Negri, because for them it is, and I quote, a collective habits and practices open to transformation from singularities. And this is very problematic if we go back to kind of John Stuart Mill and liberal theory, and also Republican theory of the idea of the tyranny of the common sense, of normality, of what is already constituted. So if the institution is based out of these collective practices that is already corrupt, and then actually singularities can actually edit this framework, this is very problematic today, especially if we think about the multitude as being fractioned into kind of neo-Nazis and other kind of forms of intolerant practices, because in a way these practices are already today becoming normalized. And if we're going to create institutions based on this normality, I think these institutions will not be democratic, right? And for Machiavelli, at least, the institutions can be added to an already existing structure. And the dynamism, the dynamic feature of the constitution doesn't come from the institution itself being edited by the singularities. It's the law which is dynamic, that is created through these institutions that are already there. And in a way, the struggle for Machiavelli, the only way that the law has this kind of like broad interpretation that could be interpreted in an emancipatory way, is that these institutions, the conflict is between the institutions of the few and the many that are already existed. And this is what we don't have today. We only have the few in power. We elect them, but they're there, and there's no popular institution to push back. So for Machiavelli, law is good only if there's a conflict, institutional conflict between the few and the many. Today we don't have the many. So the law is made by big law and the people that we elect that are already part of kind of an oligarchic structure. So, and I agree with you that there is a kind of a broad interpretation of law. However, the interpretation is most likely on the side of property and capital, because they are the tendency of republics is to kind of become more oligarchic, at least within this thought. And connecting with, I find very interesting Camille's intervention on how can we create this infrastructure that can embrace these de-alienation practices that you're talking about. Because even if Hart and Negri argue that there are other forms of domination that are not necessarily between capital and labor, right? They pay lip service to it, and they don't integrate it into the project. So intersectionality is not there, right? And there's the infrastructure is not necessarily kind of embracing this, what you call the alienating practices. So how can we integrate the alienating practices that would allow to reweave the social fabric that has been unraveled and torn apart by neoliberalism? Because this is something that we need to create. So there's nothing. Today we're automized, and so how do we create this? And this is very problematic from the theory of democracy, basically, that is this autopoietic, self-constituted, that it cannot be instituted from outside. And I think what you brought up at the end, the idea of rotation, of the idea of not being fixated to an identity, is part of, we need to consider it as part of this popular infrastructure. So we need to create a popular infrastructure that is different from what exists.
Thank you, Camila. Daniele, did you want to jump in? Now or later? Tell me.
Maybe later.
Maybe a bit later?
Later.
Okay, great. Hanok, you want to jump in? Can you pass the mic down to?
So thanks. That's really interesting. I want to make a brief comment on the kind of semi-debate between Bernard and Mikhaïl, and try to defend Mikhaïl a little bit on law, politics, and property.
You'll tell me your fees.
So on law, I think that, law is practice, as Mikhaïl said, and law is malleable, but not infinitely malleable, I think, because law, in any way you present it, is a practice that at least tries to present itself as justified. And the requirement of justification, which is part of the legal language, that sometimes it's hypocritical, obviously, is a burden that can be exploited, and that's the way I understand Mikhaïl's project. So even if the without is extremely has an important potential, and I wouldn't be able to judge what is, whether it's more or less, there is an important potential for the within from the point of view of our understanding of law as a practice. But it's not just a practice, it's not totally malleable, it's a justificatory practice, and therefore there are only that much that one can twist it. So this is the first point. The second point is about politics. And so if I understand again, Mikhaïl, it's, the point is about property, and not just every detail in the language of law. And property is in our imagination as people, not just jurists or stuff, is connected with the mind and with things that are very basic. And the notion that reformist ideas are anti-property is, I think, a conservative notion that co-opts into a neoliberal reality, because it just leaves this very powerful imagination and concept in people's everyday life, as if it is something that is actually imagined by the neoliberal. So the last point about property. So the idea that property is sole and despotic dominion is just wrong. It was never right, never ever in any place. In Europe, it has been invented at, I think, 17th century, give or take 200 years. I'm not a good historian. There's a long history, and even in our current predicament, there are many, many, many versions of property. And if you combine those, the point that I mentioned earlier, and you begin with I think it was the last thing that Mikhaïl said, about the virtues of having your personal property. Right? You need your personal property in order to engage as an individual who has a right to self-determination. Now, if you rethink property from that perspective, then you are really radical.
Okay, shall we turn back to Mikhaïl, unless there's another one and someone else. Marianne, why don't you jump in and then we'll turn back to Mikhaïl.
So I'd like to bring back the unconscious that Camille offered us so usefully. And I'm very intrigued by this whole idea that institutions that are based on conflict are constituted by conflict. And I'd like to connect it to Camilla's point about how do we expect the multitude to constitute itself when the singularities within it are already constituted by the structures that we're trying to defeat or change or transform, right? So where's the place of the unconscious in the kind of conflict? You know, what kind of conflict are we talking about when we're talking about conflict constituting institutions? And what's the place of the unconscious in the other interventions that we've heard, in the idea of property and in the idea of capital? Can we complicate this question by bringing in the indeterminate kinds of factors that the unconscious would bring in? And of course, we're talking about not just an individual, but also some kind of collective unconscious that through the kind of practice that institutional psychotherapy is practicing can somehow be transformed, but it's a constant daily process.
Marianne, do you want to start the continue the conversation?
Well, yeah, continue and start. Well, this is much too much for my little brain, so okay. So maybe Katharina, yes, we got to talk. There was in the first version of the paper, which was a longer one, something saying, and then comes the global and everything changed, and this is okay. So I fully agree with that. Something has been radically changed in the way law is functioning those last years because of what we call the globalization of the law, which, okay, but I couldn't discuss that, but couldn't agree more. Maybe the second thing I'm not going to discuss is Etienne, your last point on the only one side, because I must confess that I cheated a bit, and that in my oral presentation I already answered because I had read your paper. So maybe I'm going to leave that. One thing that I would love to say is also answering Etienne. It's about the history of property. And you're saying that I think there is an evolution, which is a bifurcation. I actually think that there are not one but two histories of property. There's the history of the idea of property, and there's the history of the practices of property. And here I join Anoch. We didn't rehearse before, but it happens that I rejoin Hanoch. I think that what we're discussing mostly here is the history of the idea of property, which is the idea of the rise and fall of a dogma. And I agree with Hanoch, this dogma never actually seriously went to the point of being dominant in practice. So what happened in practice, well, who knows? Because precisely we were masked by the dogma. An example is in French law, Article 544, the absolute rights, la la la. That's definitely the civil code. Does that mean that's what's going on the ground? I bet definitely not only. So what is the history of the practice of property? I think something much more complicated than we actually don't really know. What is sure is the dogma as disintegrated. And I think that Thomas Gray's paper about the disintegration of property is about that. It doesn't say that there's no more property, that there are no more owners. It's just saying that we don't have any more the concepts to understand what it is, because precisely that very dogma that we were using for centuries has disintegrated.
Whose practice are you talking about? Lawyers?
No,
or
no.
Shareholders?
Well, no, for example, an interesting question would be to wonder what is agricultural property, rural property in France today? Certainly not Article 544. So who is practicing it? A mixture of experts, of peasants, of lawyers, of reality.
If you want to say, I will pass my turn after that, because I don't want to if you want to say that precisely this nexus, this combination of economy and law, whose strategic point in this moment when you speak of peasants, of course, is credit, has eventually produced a situation, in which producers, entrepreneurs, formerly considered independent, and trying to meet ends by buying what they need, the seeds, etc., hiring the labor force, and on the other side, of course, going to the market with their products and desperately trying to get a good price for that. This, in fact, is a fiction. This is fiction because they are entirely expropriated of their so-called property. They are proletarians working for Monsanto, for the bank to whom they owe infinite or indefinite interest, and the big and Walmart or other big distribution societies. So that not only the law of property is still there, but as Marx in a sense beautifully anticipated, it's being used not as an instrument, of course, of appropriation, but as an instrument of actual expropriation.
Okay.
Okay. Good
so
to know.
I would
good
say,
to know, because these are facts in a sense.
Sure.
And
But I would say maybe the reality on the ground is more complicated. The last time I opened a book of rural property, I really had headaches. So it seems to me that it's not just Monsanto and the poor peasant, it's also 2,000 different ways of intervention of the state, and
Yes,
it's
of
also
course,
cooperatives, and it's
course,
also many things.
Of course,
Anyway.
you're absolutely right.
I want another point. I'm trying to be as short as possible. About the level of conflicts, I would totally agree with you. Yes, I don't think that it's only conflict within the langue of the law. I also think that there is conflict about the production of the langue of the law. So I'm not going to get into the theoretical debate, but if you got a structural analysis of the law, one should say the language of the law is not a natural language. It's much more like fashion according to Barthes rather than English according to Saussure, and therefore there's room for group of decision transforming the intermediate level, what Barthes calls écriture, and that is one, of course, key element of the conflict. And what the legal realist, what CLS, what all these critical people did is precisely transforming the very langue of the law and not only using the law for conflict within it.
The very langue.
Langue.
Language.
So
Yes.
say the langue parole thing. It's not only it's not only parole within a langue. It's parole within a langue, but with a whole level of syntagme figé and low level of écriture.
I tried to introduce a Wittgensteinian category of grammar.
Yeah.
I didn't agree with that.
Yeah, I do. So to go to the hot thing, what forces? I must say, first, I'm a bit dubious that it would be a new subject of history. So proletariat, the states, the fusion of the two. It's true that we are in search, but I would say we're not in search of the same. And second, so that was for my
Hart and Negri would
right.
agree. They permanently claim, of course.
Yes, but then they essentially.
My idea is they return to the usus pauper of the Franciscans.
And I totally agree with you. So, and certainly not big law. So it happens that yes, my main activism this last 10 years was to build a law school that would be a bit different than the ordinary faculté de droit in France. That doesn't mean that I think it's sufficient and that's it. and it will bring whatever emancipatory and revolution in France, by far. It's just that I think that whatever movements and whatever forces are there, there will be one moment where they're going to have to discuss institution, what Camille was saying about the Castoriadis idea of institutional praxis, and they will have to invent some stuff, and they will have to speak the language of the law, and at that very moment, it's going to be nice if some people speaking that language got enough legal imaginary to help them, or to connect with them, or to articulate with them. That's the only thing I was saying. And for that, it's, you know, it's nice to have critical law schools rather than dogmatic ones. That's a very modest project politically. And I would say, well, the academia is a place for political activism like another. And so my disagreement with you is not there. Is, I would say, no priority. And actually, I doubt the idea of prioritizing the spaces of intervention. I think that prioritizing leads to the idea that there would be some subject that would be privileged toward history than others. I actually think that we intervene politically from where we are. It happens that I'm a law professor and I'm intervening in the field of legal academics. That's it. I don't have a better justification for that, but it's a very modest statement, and obviously I don't think that it's just by producing a new legal elite that things will happen. Was that clear? So my answer to what forces would be, I don't know. I don't know better than, I would say, each of us. So I don't have any new subject for history to promote and to present. I don't know. So a week ago, I didn't know that the Gilets jaunes would be possible, and now here they are. I mean, who knows? So I'm not able to answer your question, Etienne. So we are in search.
Wasn't expecting that.
Voilà. A last thing to say that thank you, Camille, for the discussion. I really prefer those type of conception of what a revolution is, rather than the leap into I understand as either theology or the abstract, and sometimes the verbal, I must say, of Negri and Hart. By the way, you're very too kind with them. I mean, I have here the common advances without legal mediations and emerge as a multitude that is as the capacity of subject to bring together their singularities and productive institution of wealth and freedom. What does that mean? So, no, I don't have, it's in assembly. So, yeah, I think that it's true that we theoretically agree mostly here, but not with them. And I think here you're really too charitable. But well, so what I understand as being a revolutionary project is not a leap, and it's not ex nihilo. So it's, you know, giving new significance of an institution, giving a new significance to what we have. So here I have a quotation that I want to do because I think that it actually says pretty well what I think about that. So that's Castoriadis that you were quoting, saying that a revolution is about changing everything, but changing everything doesn't mean from nothing. And revolutionaries, they're using whatever they can with what they have, they're reinventing, and they confer new signification to the existing. And he's concluding that saying, the problem of a revolution is to install new relation to tradition, not to try to suppress it, nor to declare it from one A to Z, a Gothic absurdity. So I think that exactly, you know, the becoming other from inside, trying to provide new institutions, things that would be more democratic, more emancipatory than what we have, and see where it goes, and it can go very, very far. And on this, I don't think that property is always the bad thing and should always be abolished. Sometimes property has to be abolished. Think about slavery. Oh yes, abolish it, period. I don't think there's anything good to keep in that story. But think, for example, of the French Revolution. The French Revolution could be understood as a transfer of property. Or think South Africa today. What about redistribution of the land without compensation? That would be a revolutionary move that I support personally. That wouldn't be abolition of property, that would be transfer of property. Fine. So, and sometimes it's, being indifferent to property is also the rightful attitude politically. So I stop here just to say that I don't think that what is revolutionary is always the leap outside.
Etienne, did you want to say another word?
Just very quickly, I promise. Okay, I won't continue the debate about capitalism. We'll come back later. But when you said you're discussing the idea of property, and I want to discuss the practices. So that's the terrible. We immediately, I feel, of course, illegitimate, impotent, everything. But then I ask myself the question, and I just put it like that. Is there such an absolute divide between the idea on one side and the practices on the other side?
Take it as la folie n'existe pas. So that's what I mean.
Okay.
So la propriété n'existe pas in that sense.
Okay, on that, yes. My master Althusser, who sometimes had crazy ideas, was fond, always repeated, and clearly for him that was not a solution, that was a kind of problem or an enigma that he wanted to resolve. In matters of philosophy of law, he was a complete Kelsenian and Kantian, but that was not Kelsenian. He always said the specificity of law is the fact that it's not actually different from its own ideologies. That is, law is very strange discourse, call it like that if you like, in the categories of the time, where practice and ideology are not actually separated. So it's not just a justification from outside. And of course you can use that in both directions, which could be, I don't know if that has to do with Marianne's question, but could lead, of course, to the idea that there's something psychotic in law. I mean, there's something absolutely psychotic in law. And of course this must find limits sometimes. I understand that all your practice and your discourse rejects that idea. When you say law is, there's no outside, you don't want to take it until the idea that law is a kind of self-referential, absolutely psychotic discourse. And that's because, of course, you're a good Foucauldian, and I not only I understand that, but I approve of it. I mean, you want to propose the absolutely opposite idea, which is the idea of the permanent battle. I mean, with the idea that Foucault put at the end of Discipline and Punish. Let's listen to the noise of the battle. In fact, it's everywhere. And so that's a methodological choice. It doesn't okay. And the last thing I would like to say is not replying, but reacting to what Bernard said, which also had to do with this opposition between ideas or theories and concepts on one side and practice on the other side. You said, and you wrote in your commentary, this is all very nice, describing the infinite malleability. We might reflect a little more on the term infinite. In fact, there is the difference between a finite malleability and an infinite malleability is not just a question of degree, because the idea of infinite malleability is what might call you towards what I call the superior level. That is the one where you do not simply play the according to the rules of the game in a different manner as actively as you can, but you actually question and the rules themselves. But in any case, your point was, this is all very nice, but the fact is that law, the practice of law, the use of law, that's entirely in the hands of people who are absolutely not interested in your prospects of revolutionary transformation. They're entirely on the other side. So and that I think raises a number of interesting questions. Why is it that we believe, we have very strong evidence of that, of course, in a sense, that once and forever the power-knowledge nexus is entirely in the hands of a caste that is above the people, outside the multitude, totally isolated from them. So perhaps that's true not only for law, of course. You could say, once again, the same for economists. And we are under a permanent pressure from educational institutions, newspapers, even the progressive, the good ones, Krugman and others, they are experts. I mean, that's not for the people. They will tell you the models can be twisted in a different manner, but nobody will have access to that. That will remain a totally, and there are other examples. So is that unbreakable? That's the question. That's the question. Is that a division of labor forever? Of course, somebody like Marx had dreamt that not only he could invent a kind of proletarian economic theory, but the proletarians themselves would somehow know enough or understand enough about it to seize it in their own hands. But that went along with an idea, unfortunately, totally wrong at the same time, which was bourgeois political economy is finished. It's becoming just a vulgar apology. And of course, not only that was not the case, but it reinvented itself continuously in order to facilitate, I would say, capitalist innovations that the proletarians had no idea of.
Merci, Etienne. Before I jump in, Camille, you want to?
Just one word about the unconscious still. I think, yeah, what I found very interesting is the idea also of the unconscious as a diagnostic tool for these consolidations, if you'd like, of what Dardo and Laval call the kind of the transfer of the l'instituant dans l'institué, so the the solidification in some ways of the institutionalizing moment, and I think that even a book like Anti-Oedipus is still, I think, quite interesting in that way, in the sense that Deleuze and Guattari write this after May '68, and that they say that they try to understand the reasons behind the aborted revolution of May '68, and part of it is to understand how what they call fascisms could coincide with revolutionary intentions, and you can't do this without a notion of the unconscious, I think. And we're very much still stuck with this problem. I mean, it's the Trump election. How could this happen, right? How could these people have such? So it's hard. It's hard for me to understand this without a notion of the unconscious. Of course, the question then becomes, how do you mobilize this politically, right? Socially. So the Gris was one example. And Guattari tried throughout his life to find social groups, political activities where you would do this. There's what's interesting to me about institutional psychotherapy is it's not, for example, anti-psychiatry. It's not saying like, let's remove all order, let's let everybody be free, something will happen, right? There is still this idea that you need to institute, right? You need an instituting person, in this case the doctor. But the doctor is almost like a psychoanalyst. He's both extremely important and not important at all. because what's important is the moment of transference. Is that so? So how could we? And this is where I'm stuck. But I would love your help. But politically, how could we do this? To figure out a way where you would have this kind of, process where it wouldn't be the figure, you would need the figure, but it wouldn't be the figure per se. And how could we kind of mobilize this to politically, again, we could think of Foucault's preface to Anti-Oedipus, where he says that, where he calls it the book of ethics, as I said, but also the idea of getting rid of not only the fascisms in the world, but the fascisms in your head also, right?
Well, can I just say one word? Education?
Yeah, that's.
Okay, so quickly, before I turn to Esteban, Daniele, and Jason, just some thoughts on some of this conversation, because, my goal is not to defend or rehabilitate Hart and Negri, but to draw on the text in order to imagine what's possible here and to figure out where the stakes are. So if we just look at the text for a second, right? So page 98 of Assembly, right? Today they write, we have the potential to establish modes of sharing wealth that are equal and open, to institute a right to decide together democratically about the access, use, management, and distribution of wealth. And of course, the deployment of the term right is interesting there, right? Now, keep in mind, Chanuk, to avoid confusion, that this conception of the common is aimed at social wealth, not individual possessions. There's no need to share your toothbrush or even give others say over most things you make yourself. So it's not inherently, so imagining the common, as we can together imagine it, regardless of how others are imagining it, but on using some of this text, it doesn't necessarily apply to all individual possessions, but it is a conception of certain things, the common, being regulated through a right to decide together democratically about access, use, management. Now, in responding, they also then turn to Eleanor Ostrom's work, and they say, there can be indeed already, this is on page 99, exist collective forms of self-management. And quoting Ostrom, a self-governed common property arrangement in which the rules have been devised and modified by the participants themselves and also are monitored and enforced by them, right? So as systems of democratic participation. Now, of course, this does raise complicated questions about what those regulatory mechanisms will be, and particularly about the enforcement of those regulatory mechanisms. I think clearly, though, from a critical legal theory perspective, we are sufficiently internal to law. We remain sufficiently internal to law to satisfy those objections in terms of the scope and reach of the law, and the potential malleability. And so I think that really what it does do then is it pushes us not to confront this proposal as being inadequate theoretically from a critical legal theory perspective, right? I don't think that's the issue anymore. I think the question has to be, well, let's flesh it out. As we flesh it out, though, I take it that the two questions become: how would it be possible to move to the common in some way, to push the different forms of property possession in that direction? Who's going to be doing that? And there, Etienne, I do think that there is a problem with the political economy of law, the way it's structured in this country, and the way it functions at an institution like Columbia Law School, for instance, where there is a kind of a vortex sucking magnetic force, right, that draws all the young public-interested and public-minded and public-spirited individuals who go to law school to change the world to Wall Street, all right? That is a loud. You can hear the vortex. You can hear it's like a funnel. It's like right, and they all come in bright-eyed. I get them the first day they come in, wanting to do good and change the world, and through institutional mechanisms, by the end of the first summer, right, they have all submitted their resumes to the, what is it called? EOC, right? And they're gone. And then we get a new crew of bushy, bright-eyed, optimistic kids who come in, right? So there is a institutional design problem that means it's what?
Not only in the law school. Of course, in the humanities, they have very few possibilities in that direction.
Right.
But at CIPA
Right.
or...
Yeah. But the question is whether what is produced is a certain form of skill and training that then creates a form of elitism that proves that tells me that, okay, so as I'm trying to figure this out, and as we continue to everything we can creating critical institutions.
At our law school, we
Right.
were able to diminish the astonishing number of students going to the French equivalent of Wall Street. So it's still a big number, but we were able to subvert, I would say, 20 to 30%.
And what do they do in life?
Whatever, including selling flowers and becoming musicians. No, they do that. And then they also
Working
do
for NGOs or for
so
associations?
working for the NGOs, associations, or working for very small law firms that are more oriented to public interest and those kind of things. We have a bunch of those in France, or anything.
But there still is here a problem of an availability heuristic, I think. In other words, that tiny fraction of the population, in other words, when we are thinking about this, as a question, I think, of prioritizing, I think we do need to prioritize. The problem with the availability heuristic is that you just don't take account of the fact that there are, that it's such a small fraction here versus this concept, again, loose. I don't necessarily want to embrace it of a multitude, but of a different political space where work would be done. Okay, before we monopolize this, Esteban, and let me pass the mic. Oh, here's a mic. You pass that around. And then we'll go to Daniele, and then Jason.
I'm an economist, so maybe my comments will be a little bit out of context. I'm not a lawyer or a philosopher, but I would like to bring to your attention the importance that economists have in defending private property. In fact, property is at the very basis of the economic theory that is taught in every university almost in the world. Property is linked to economics because without property you cannot define a price for a commodity or a good, a relative price. And since relative prices allocate resources, you cannot allocate resources without first having defined property. You cannot have equilibrium. In order to have equilibrium and order, you must first have your private property defined. Economists in general refer to this as endowments, which is a euphemism for private property. You have three sets of data, which are basically technology, preferences, and endowments, and their distribution, and boom, you have prices. Any person that draws a curve of supply and demand is defending private property. And that's very unconscious in even people that supposedly are critical of the mainstream, including Krugman, Stiglitz, Jeffrey Sachs, for example. So that's a big stumbling block in trying to do away with property or trying to introduce a notion of commonality into social life. It's extremely unconscious. The second, it's part of the discourse. And actually, any journalist or anyone outside the economics profession that does not understand theory actually uses the same vocabulary and the same words and the same concepts. So that's an important thing. In order to, let's say, eliminate or in order to reduce property, private property, you basically have to destroy economic theory. So when we talk about masters of property, economists are very, very important, play an extremely important role. The other comment that I wanted to make is about Marx. I think I've heard a lot about Marx, and I like very much Marx. I studied Marx, I studied at the New School, but I think it's important to go a little bit beyond Marx. And because the whole concept of Marx and the whole concept of property and the whole concept of surplus value is based on a rigid dichotomy between what's productive and what's financial. Everything in Marx comes out of the productive sphere without the need or without the interference of finance. And that no longer holds in today's world or in today's stage of capitalism. And I'm referring to the concept of financialization, to the fact that today really what is real is becoming more and more financial. The financialization creates objects of desire and it transforms property. It creates objects of appropriation, and most importantly, it has brought back a class, which a social class, which is called the rentier class, which is fairly responsible for not channeling, let's say, finance to production, and also for increasing inequality. Thank you.
Thank you. Daniele, do you want to pull that mic there? And then let's pass that on to Jason.
Thank you very much. It was just a very brief comment question that I want to raise because in your answer, Mikhaïl, it seems to me that you were a little more clear about the difference between the fact that we can consider law to be critical or not, or the fact that we have to create subjects that can use law in a critical way or not. And I wanted to ask you a little more about this, because it seems to me that, you know, even if we take Foucault, you know, beyond discipline and punishment, the first volume of the history of sexuality, and we take him more, you know, in the context of governmentality and so on, we can say that there's no outside does not mean that there's no asymmetry between the productivity of law, economy, all the mechanisms of power, and the productivity of the subjects, and that there's a sort of, you know, ontological priority in the capacity that subjects have to actually resist or, on the contrary, be subjugated to those mechanisms. So my question is, precisely because in order to resist Negri and art and their essentialization of law, you want to say that law is in itself, I would say, neither good or bad. Would you still say that law is in itself, I mean, would you still say that law is the first and principal tool that we have to use in order to be critical, or would you just say that it is one of the tools that we have, and maybe law is not capable of producing critical subjects, and so we have to figure out ways to produce critical subjects that can use law as a way to actually be critical.
So Marianne was dropping the word education when we were discussing what to do. So I understand legal educational system as legal orders. I understand, and that requires law. So I don't think that the productivity of the law is just to submit and to assujettir. I think that the productivity of the law goes in every direction. I think that law is everywhere, like many other things actually. So now that we're here, we could have a legal analysis of what is going on, and we could have an economic one, and these are not conflicting and not contradicting. So yes, law per se is neither good and bad. No, you have usages that are different. Some are better than others, and some bad usages are dominant, and some good usages are marginal, and that can make a huge difference in real life. But yes, you got the point. I think that law is neither good or bad. It's just, so it is, and that's why I don't think we should prioritize. No, I mean, that it's not the, now we should all do law and start expressing every wish, claim, or whatever in legal terms. That doesn't make sense. It's just we should be aware that it's a constituted dimension of everything we do. When you go buy bread, you actually, it's a contract. So that's nice to know that. And yes, I think with Etienne and with Dana, that it's possible to make that knowledge a bit more shared than what it is today, and that would have some nice. I don't think you said that, Etienne, the way you actually said the question, the comment, but I think there's some room for work here. That's what I would say.
Jason.
Great. I mean, my question really does follow that pretty directly. There's so much to think about here, but I kept coming back to this idea that there is no outside of the law, and Bernard's point that the law is infinitely malleable, and that when Hart and Negri construe a common, that it is a regulated space and therefore a legal regime or a legally regulated space. And I guess I worry about the capaciousness of this discourse of the law that's working in these presentations. And it seems to cut against the thrust of the criticisms. In other words, what I take all of the panelists to be doing in a really productive way, it's a very sympathetic but critical engagement with Hart and Negri, but is to really push against what Leclau called the wish to heaven aspect of Hart and Negri's, or the appeal to heaven, the metaphysical wish dimension, and instead focus on institutional specificity in Camille's presentation, like these spaces of disalienation and institutional psychotherapy, and then Mikhaïl, I think in the presentation you gave today, this really productive, zeroing in on elements of property law that have potential for political and emancipatory transformation rather than simply being set aside. So I take that to be really the critical thrust of much of what's been said here, and I do worry that this overly capacious understanding of the law as a specific regime of regulation, like I get the point about justification, the justificatory dimension of law, but I think the law has it's a particular modality of regulation, right? And I think saying something about its specificity, I think either your comments kind of brought this up for me as well. Saying something about its specificity might be an important preface to really engaging with what are the emancipatory potentials and limitations of legal reform. So that's
Thanks, Jason. Very helpful. Camille, I think maybe we'll come back this way with any final thoughts, because we're getting close to the end here. And then.
Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to think about what Jason is saying, but I think I need more time. I don't know if The question then again, if you don't have this idea of the capaciousness of the law, how else? I mean, how do you get outside the dichotomy of the capaciousness of the law and the self-constituted moment, right? The kind of magical constitution. I mean, what else is another alternative?
Here's a point that kept occurring to me. I mean, one of the things, like I write on constituent power and democratic theory, one of the things that endlessly bothers me about contemporary discussions of constituent power, as the legal scholars in the room know, has really come to the center, especially of kind of Anglo-American discussions of the law, in a way that it simply wasn't before, like when Negri was writing his work in the 70s. But as it's come to the center, it's been domesticated as a concept where do you look for constituent power? Well, you look in constitutional conventions, you look in these, even if they're not constituted forms of authority, parliaments and so on, you look at what we could construe as somehow constitutional forms of authority, rather than seeing constituent power as something that is also always in part outside the law in a meaningful way. I think the juridical frame reveals certain things and limits certain things. So that's I think you could reproduce examples of how that idea that there is no outside of the law seems more specific to me. Again, as a particular modality of regulation and adjudication and enforcement. And the question of whether Hart and Negri, with their invocation of the common, it may be a regulated space, like that's, I agree with Bernard on that. But I think we'd have to say more about the specificity of law to answer the question of whether or not it is a legal regime.
Yeah, and that's why perhaps it might be interesting to think of this idea of praxis more generally as a kind of, that would offer these other spaces. That would, I mean, that's at least that's what Deldo and Laval argue here, that it would offer an alternative to the problem is that Negri and Hart oppose constituted power to instituting power without actually thinking about how constituted power is also itself a kind of moment of production. And what they're interested in is the kind of auto-production of a collective subject with specific rules, right? So it's an individual subject, but it's also a collective subject that needs to be produced all the time, but with also specific rules of action. You disagree, but we'll talk about it later.
Okay. Etienne, final thoughts?
Complicated.
I'm asking for a grammar of the law. That is what.
No, but I'm impressed by what Esteban said, not only about Marx, but about the function of property in economic theory. I was trying to move in that direction, but with less precision, of course, and knowledge. There remains something powerfully Manichaean, if you like, in the grand narrative, the grand revolutionary narrative, of which Hart and Negri are extraordinary, recent representatives. So that's the idea that you somehow you face a binary choice. And when Mikhaïl again and again insists on the idea that law per se is not either good or bad, you head-on attack, in a sense, the core of that, perhaps unconscious, of that discourse. That leads to notions which themselves are problematic, such as neutrality, of course. That's the idea that law would be a neutral instrument, therefore, which is not. Then malleability, and so I'm trying to understand how we can navigate between only two obvious necessary critique of the old theological understanding of history as the global history, as the choice between the city of God and the city of the earthly city of sin. City of sin, that's what it is. And on the other hand, this notion of malleability, which can be permeated, which can be continuously infused, I would say, with the insistence on the idea that this is a place of battle, that this is always conflictual, that and probably also you would say, certainly that's why you wouldn't say neutral, that in such battles, you said it, in fact. I mean, the instruments or the weapons are not just to be taken from one hand to be turned against the former user by others. So there's a kind of intrinsic, how to say, contamination, I would say, of not the idea you would read about, of the discourse or the categories, the concepts, and the actions, and the forces who use it. And then the problem, I finish with, the problem becomes, of course, at what level are we going to try and almost experimentally or practically discuss this kind of issues. The Manichaean narrative also relies, this is very clear in Marx, on a kind of permanent contamination, I would say, of the idea of totality. The social system is a totality on the one side, and on the other hand, the idea of globality, the idea that this is something that a game that is played at the level of the whole world. But globalization today, precisely, produces not the permanent verification of that identity, but on the contrary, it dismantles it, and that's why I had in mind, and you mentioned it, so I was very gratified. The paper I've written on law of hospitality in Le Monde, which is also translated into English. It's a question of my this is a global problem. Environment would be the same, of course, a similar kind of issue. This is a global problem. How are you going to address it? Even, and of course, all the more from an anti-capitalist and anti-neoliberal, anti-utilitarian point of view. You're not going to destroy the states. This is sheer absurdity. To organize the common from today until tomorrow, to impose a different kind of regulation, or perhaps simply to impose a regulation. So the idea that came to my mind, and of course I was criticized for being totally idealistic, was there must be legal instruments that curb somehow the power of the states. Of course, because the states cannot work without the law. And therefore the law, in a sense, has some capacity to counteract, if you like. That's the case in many. But of course, that just pushes the question once again towards the unknown problem of the multitude, if you want to call it like that, which has the power, perhaps in the middle of catastrophes. We've seen that already in the past, to make the idea of international law curbing the sovereignty of the states in matters of environment or migration, something that is effective, that works.
Thank you, Etienne. Mikhaïl, do you want to? Okay, you'll write another 60-page paper.
Absolutely.
In response.
I actually did. I can read it if you wish, or you go. What do you prefer?
Last words.
No.
No?
No. I already spoke too much.
Okay. All right. Well. So first of all, a big round of thanks and applause for our extraordinary panel. And for all of you and your questions. So next we take Praxis back to Frankfurt. So in 2 weeks, on December 19th, we'll be meeting in the original seminar room of the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt with Martin Czar and others there. We'll be reading a little bit of Adorno on Praxis, a little bit of Marcuse, and we'll also be reading Bruno Latour's new book, Down to Earth. which is available outside. We'll also be live streaming it for anyone who's still on U.S. soil. Anyone who's going to be close to Frankfurt should tell me, in the kind of, flight search, or Frankfurt or anything in the, 800-kilometer vicinity or something. Tell me, and I will find a way to get you to the Institute. Thank you very much,
Thank you, Bernard.
and thank you.
Bernard.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you for organizing it.